Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
These state universities are teaching our children to be strangers to us, to despise our nation. We're not going to pay for them anymore. It's over. We elect our state legislatures. These states should defund these universities. They can do other things. They can say, look, the University of Florida, not to pick on it, I don't know really much about it, but just to use that example, they can say, all right, well, you know, the sciences and the engineering schools are pretty healthy. The humanities and social sciences are decrepit. This university is chartered in the state of Florida. Let's divide those two into two colleges. We'll keep the sciences and we'll defund the others. And if parents want to pay the full and rising tuition costs for this kind of thing, we're not going to support it. They can go ahead and do that and bleed them dry. These things can be tried.
Welcome, everyone, once again to the Roundtable, the editors and publishers podcast here at the American Mind at the Claremont Institute. I'm your host, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind, joined with the full contingent today, James Pullis, executive editor of the American Mind, Matthew Peterson, VP of Education at Claremont, founding editor of the American Mind, Spencer Clavin, associate editor of the American Mind and the Claremont Review of Books, Seth Barron, managing editor of the American Mind, and for the first 20 minutes or so of the show, a special guest, Arthur Milikh, the executive director of our just opened Center for the American Way of Life in Washington, D.C. We've been planning this for months. Arthur's been hard at work lining up Washington fellows and writings and policy agendas and everything. But we launched publicly finally on Tuesday. I just want to read the first few paragraphs of Arthur's opening statement on the purpose of this place, and then we can talk about it and get Arthur's embellishments and have a discussion. The title of the piece is "A New Conservatism Must Emerge." America is currently engaged in a regime-level struggle that will preserve or destroy the purpose that has defined it. On one side stands the American way of life, characterized by Republican self-government and the habits of mind and character necessary to sustain it. On the other side stands identity politics, which demands the perpetual punishment and humiliation of so-called oppressor groups, combined with the unquestioned rule of the so-called marginalized. These two regimes are in conflict and cannot coexist. The regime of identity politics has already conquered nearly all of America's major institutions and dominates the moral high ground. The universities and schools, Fortune 500 companies, much of the media and image-making industries, big tech, and the administrative state are put to use waging war on the American way of life. Many of these institutions attack, ban, and slander everything for which America stands, alleging that the rule of law is racist, that freedom of speech is white supremacist, that the family is misogynist and homophobic, and that anything short of open borders is xenophobic. The nation cannot survive this trajectory. Okay, last paragraph. But the conquest of these institutions does not prove that the arc of history bends left. Rather, it has occurred largely because of the weakness of the opposition. Mainstream conservatism today cannot reverse these potentially fatal trends and cannot conserve the American way of life because it lacks clear understanding of its own purpose. In its purposelessness over the last generation, it too often outsourced its thinking to economists while allowing the left to define its conscience and its culture. This mistake will prove disastrous if not corrected. And Arthur's going to fix all that. So it'll be great. Arthur, congrats on the launch. It's been a long time coming, and it's been fun planning it, and now we have to get to work.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
You've been doing media this week. You'll continue throughout the rest of the week. What are your sort of opening plans for the center in the coming months?
Well, I appreciate you reading the statement. You could say that, why is another center or think tank necessary? And the reason for that is that, regrettably, I've been in Washington for a long time, and I know how a lot of the Washingtonians think, and they are a kind of combination, for the most part, a combination of two things: narrow, nose to the grindstone, on discrete policy issues, many of which are not particularly relevant, broadly speaking, to this kind of situation that we're in, or they live in constant fear of the left, which is only counterbalanced by their envy of the left. They want the left's prestige. They want to be quoted in the New York Times. They think that their life has been made if they are quoted in the New York Times. And so this class of people to whom safeguarding political liberty has been entrusted have been sailing on the fumes of Reaganism for a generation, while saying to the public that so long as the economy prospers, all things will be well. And so the idea behind this center is, number one, that there isn't very much clarity as to the situation, as you read, that the nation faces. One way to understand that is that, there are a lot of academics who, blather for years about tyranny, authoritarianism. Well, I suspect that an Iraqi citizen, an average Iraqi citizen, knows more about tyranny and authoritarianism than those people. And this is part of the problem, that the situation that we're in as a nation needs to be brought to light. And in doing that, there has to be a wrestling with what conservatism has stood for and whether those things that it claims for itself are doing a good job or a bad job at preserving political liberty. And as I pretty clearly said, I think that the record is so-so, and it needs to be revitalized, and it needs to be made manlier, firmer. Its backbone needs to be straightened. And the only way to do that is to remind it of its purpose. One last thing that I'll mention is all of the nation's major institutions are currently in control of the left, for the most part, with some few exceptions or some few ambiguities. And the right has not even really tried to wrestle those things away. Just to give you one example, everybody has been screaming about woke universities. Well, has anybody done anything about them? I mean, really, do you think that there are no levers of power that are possible to use against them? An easy one, an obvious one, is that these places, after all, are funded by taxpayers, by the federal and state governments. There have been so far no attempts to do anything like that. And it's been more in the way of complaining. And so once you start seeing the situation that we're in, and once you start really thinking through the levers of power at your disposal, and what one should do with them, it becomes clear that these institutions, in a way, are weaker than they appear to be. They're very strong if you just take a look at them together in a bouquet and say it's over, but it's not over. Conservatives haven't actually fought on some of these issues, haven't fought to reclaim or defund or undermine these institutions. And that's a major part of what our center, and we hope others, will start doing.
Yeah, an emblematic response of the old conservatism, I think, in the context of your university's example, came from George Will back when the Trump administration proposed the modest endowment tax, back when they had control of Congress. The Republicans did. Somebody like Will's response, in his particular response, was, this is anti-intellectualism to tax modestly these large, swollen endowments that make a lot of these, especially the Ivies, look more like hedge funds with schools attached to them than the alternative.
Yeah, George Will is a good example because what's beneath that idea is that there's any intellectualism going on in these universities. And George Will, who for many years has been, a very respectable and interesting person, very much prides himself on having gone to Princeton. And it's one of these things that, well, the university is corrupt, and yet you're still proud of being a part of it. It's one of these dissonances in the minds of conservatives, that they want the honors, the credentialing by institutions that hate them, that want to purge themselves of these kinds of people. And the the implicit counsel of George Will is that, well, we should stand idly by while a great deal of harm is done to the nation, to students, to science, because science will, if this isn't stopped, soon assume the morality of identity politics, which is to say, it's not the innovations, the discoveries, the high merits of scientists, but it's what they look like that should fill the positions. And so there's a great deal at stake. And so to call this anti-intellectual is a kind of snobbery, underneath which is a kind of romantic hope that all will be well somehow. And it need not be our will and our striving that make it well.
Have you found, Arthur, I mean, when you start talking this way, my first intuition is that you're going to get all sorts of accusations lobbed at you. The names, there's no name really that they won't call somebody who's willing both to contest conservative orthodoxy, but also to kind of call the excesses of the left what they are, which is mostly things like racism and just anti-intellectualism of the true kind. Are you getting pushback? Especially, I mean, you're in DC. Are you finding yourself the object of personal attacks or things of that nature? Or maybe that's still to come.
Well, maybe it's still to come. But I will say generally that, I mean, we all know this, and all the listeners know this, that it's really so long as those kinds of accusations are allowed to destroy people, that very otherwise flimsy power has a true power over us. And that's something that has to be overcome by our side if there is to be some kind of, balance of power, let's say, in the nation between right and left. And I think that a lot of people know that many of these accusations are a fraud and just a tool of power, that there's a great deal of hypocrisy underneath them. And so, I look at this as these things need to be said. And if they're not going to be said, that's how we actually lose.
Arthur, it's Matt. My question for you would be, what does a center in DC that's not led by a cuck nor employing cucks do? I mean, what's its operational procedures? Like, what is it, what is it trying to accomplish day to day, as opposed to, what these other clowns have been doing?
Well, first of all, there are, you know how the left very, very nicely keeps its own people in check and limits the horizon of things that they can and can't say. Well, a similar thing takes place on the right. And there are a lot of young people in DC, and not just young, middle age, who have seen that the conservatism of the last generation is worn out. In many ways, it served its purpose, but they are longing for answers. They are longing to understand our very bizarre and perilous situation. And so there are a lot of young and middle-aged people to cultivate and educate. And I don't mean to say that it's my job to educate them. We have a lot of very talented scholars, both in the DC Center and at Claremont generally, who will now have access to these people. So, Matt, that's a part of it. And these people are not just, an intern somewhere at a marketing, department, but these are people on the Hill, in law firms, people that have influence, spread the message. So there's a very big audience there to cultivate and inform.
Arthur's getting a question from every one of us, so I may as well pile on here. What I would like to hear, Arthur, is a little bit more about the obsolete romanticism of the institutionalized right. Why is this a problem? Where did it come from? I think that so much of what has passed for intellectual work on the right over the decades has been really an effort to capture the imagination, and that we now find ourselves in a time when the imagination just ain't what it used to be. Sort of what has the imagination done for me lately is the thought that is, I think, on a lot of people's minds, maybe at a subconscious level, but nevertheless. What do you think sort of went wrong with the rhetoric of the right and that kind of rosy sense that if we just get the vision thing down, then all the rest will follow?
Well, I do think that any political movement cannot just be characterized by anger and disillusionment. So I don't hold it against them that the vision has some kind of hopeful element. Of course, it has a hopeful element. Human beings all want to be happy, and happiness is always in the future. Very few people just experience it. It's the hope for it. So I don't begrudge them that. There has to be some kind of vision. I think a part of it is the extent to which that the right was captured by this exceedingly narrow understanding of what one should hope for. And it was characterized by a growing economy and the lucre, the spending, the license that accompanies that, combined with these kinds of cheesy, sentimental, private views of happiness. Like, Rousseau has a very nice line in the letter to D'Alembert that it's the hope of every young man to just fall in love. That's the kind of limit of happiness. And that's not, that. My view is that those two visions don't make a free people. They make private beings, deeply private beings who live only for private satisfaction.
Does that have something to do with the unmanned character of the institutionalized right, do you think?
Say that again?
The sort of like the unmanned character of the institutionalized right. When you talk about stiffening spines and creating a more manful approach toward governance and toward regime questions.
Yes, that's right. You don't safeguard political liberty if the peak of happiness is spending, buying, and falling in love. That's what, you guys know me, and you guys know that I'm from Russia. And so I know a lot of Soviet lore because I grew up with people that were shaped by that regime, and I asked them a lot of questions. And, and I, by the way, I should add that I really hate this, constant conservative refrain. We're becoming the Soviet Union. Communists are overtaking. This is not quite true. But one thing is true, that the less political a people becomes, the more they live only in private indulgences. And they're not really capable of caring for their communities, of legislating, of even self-legislating for that matter, ruling their passions. And so that's, regrettably, that's partly a democratic problem in general, but it has to, from time to time, be revamped, re-energized. A reassertion that you're a free people has to take place. And, that's a part of what Trumpism was, that I think in his own unique way, he did quite well, reminding Americans that this is your country. You have a country. And you're illegitimately ruled by elites, and sparking in them this desire to rule themselves, the view that there's something noble in ruling yourselves and not just being ruled by people that despise you.
We were talking a little bit off mic, Arthur, about the sort of dissident right, the people, many of them young, many of them, listeners to this podcast, who on the one hand have sort of lost patience with American idealism, especially of the sorts that James is describing. But on the other hand, furnish a lot of that manly energy and dissatisfaction with decay that we're going to need if we're going to make this project successful. And it's been kind of an obsession of mine, and I think of ours here, how to get those people on board without coming across to them as cringe, without triggering a number of the reactions that they are prone to. One of them that we were talking about is the black pill, a term used to indicate that there's really nothing, that the truth is that it's all despair and all hope is a kind of illusion. I wonder what your view is of sort of how to speak to and galvanize that youthful energy in the right direction.
Well, I think that anger and disgust alone do not make a political movement. They have their role. Anger and disgust come from the view that an injustice has been done to you. But one needs other people and education, either through great books or great political people or great writers, to make sense of that anger and disgust. And maybe to moderate it sometimes, because anger and disgust lead to dreaming up equally romantic, though dark, alternatives of vengeance or of some kind of purification. I mean, that I think characterizes in a way that psychology that I described, both left and right, both fringes of it. So there needs to be these people may have sometimes sensible opinions, sometimes worthy opinions without question. But I think the problem is to take things too personally, and in addition to think that the situation is utterly dark and hopeless. Because as you mentioned, we discussed, this view that things are utterly dark and hopeless means that you are not capable of providing any kind of opposition, any kind of reasonable, rational opposition, so as to cultivate a movement. And instead you withdraw. And by withdrawing, you make it doubly easy for them to rule over you, and for them to be as ungenerous and unkind to you as they say they want to be. So this is what Trump did so well, is that he crystallized in just a couple of phrases what has happened to the country, what the left and the right has done, and what the direction ought to be. And those people were not just dejected and angry, but they were actually quite hopeful for some periods of time. So this is the role of political statesmen, and I hope some worthy ones emerge, in order to use those energies to articulate to them their feelings and to guide them.
Arthur, this is Seth. Yeah, I mean, I get the feeling that there's a sense of keeping our powder dry among Trump supporters. I don't necessarily think everyone has embraced a pessimism, but at the same time, when we saw Trump try to make moves towards restoring, certain American principles, we saw all of the captured institutions respond virtually at once, as though they were all part of the same body, and respond, with redoubled harshness. And I think it kind of flummoxed him. How do we I mean, you said that virtually all of the institutions have been captured. I would say, I mean, I'm not sure which haven't, maybe local law enforcement. But, I mean, in a sense, how do we work against that? Is there a way to undermine it? Is there a way to, how do you oppose something that is so seemingly total? That's my question.
Well,
we saved the easy ones for you on your opening here appearance.
Yeah, definitely.
No, I love it. Look, Seth, two things. The first is that Trump was a one-man show. And in being a one-man show, he nevertheless did a great deal of good. I suppose little of which was actually policy, insofar as most things will likely be reversed in the coming year. But much of it was in terms of revitalizing certain very healthy patriotic sentiments, let's say very broadly. And so that the press could not stop. The constellation of all of those institutions could not stop. At least at the time, maybe you could say, well, now he's off of Twitter. And now, they wouldn't cover his rallies. Maybe so. But those 74 million people, or however many, are not going away. And what Trump did was exposed to a greater degree than George W. Bush's administration, even though he didn't try, exposed that constellation of powers is almost absolute and is exceedingly dishonest. That is a very important and powerful service that can now be taken up by whoever follows. So that's number one. Number two is that I actually think that conservatives have not tried to actually conserve very much over the last generation. They haven't tried what I'm proposing. So I'll just give you one example. Spencer and I talked about this a moment ago. Everybody talks about universities. Everybody complains about them, how they're radical, blah, blah, blah. Well, nothing's been done with them. And the partial reason is what Ryan, I think it was Ryan, talked about George Will, that they still want to honor these institutions. Yes, Harvard is woke and wants to destroy the nation, but I need my kids to go there. And when I see a Harvard shirt on somebody, I think, wow, that person is smart. In other words, conservatives are in this contradiction that on the one hand, they know that these things are dangerous. And on the other hand, they want to look up to them and want to be respected by them. And so a different approach is to say, no, we're free citizens, and these are alien bodies. These state universities are teaching our children to be strangers to us, to despise our nation. We're not going to pay for them anymore. It's over. We elect our state legislatures. These states should defund these universities. They can do other things. They can say, look, the University of Florida, not to pick on it, I don't know really much about it, but just to use that example, they can say, all right, well, the sciences and the engineering schools are pretty healthy. The humanities and social sciences are decrepit. This university is chartered in the state of Florida. Let's divide those two into two colleges. We'll keep the sciences and we'll defund the others. And if parents want to pay the full and rising tuition costs for this kind of thing, we're not going to support it. They can go ahead and do that and bleed them dry. These things can be tried. I'll give you just one other example of trying things that conservatives hitherto have not. James and I have discussed this many times. Google controls 90% of the world's searches, And yet we say, no, this private company has every right to continue to do that, even if it affects the outcome of elections, even if it is used to impose a different morality onto the nation, if it's used to harm the nation. We're just going to sit this one out, conservatives say. Well, there are antitrust laws. There are states also that can pursue these kinds of options. Conservatives have been like George Will. They have been thinking that things will, they like to say, if something can't go on, it won't. Well, this is the perspective of God, you say that if you have eternal time on your side, but we all have children, and we all have our lives to live. And so there is this kind of more aggressive, more manly approach that I think is possible and that is pursuable if we look at this in the manner that I have described. and that other people that I very much look up to at Claremont have described, that the situation is rather dire, and we have to retool ourselves and rethink our approach.
Well, Arthur, I know out on the East Coast you've got to go, so thank you for this wonderful précis on the new center. I should encourage everyone to go visit the website for the Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. It has Arthur's opening statement. It's also the first item at americanmind.org, and we look forward to bragging about the center's work on this podcast, and I encourage everyone to follow the work of the center and follow Arthur's work too.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks, Arthur. Well, we're sad transition here to the passing of a legend today, Rush Limbaugh. Most of you, well, not most of you, everyone will hear this the day after that sad news, but I thought we ought to talk a little bit about Rush's reach and his significance in American political life and radio life, communications life. It's pretty extraordinary. Just a few stats to run off, and then we can hit the ground running with Rush. So at his height, he had about 20 million weekly listeners. He went on his first sort of syndication. Rush bounced around jobs, did some baseball broadcasting in Kansas City, I think. He's from Cape Girardeau, Missouri, originally, and a very interesting place. If you don't know about it, go check it out. And then in 1988, got his first syndication gig. Went much bigger in 97, although part of the reason he went bigger and part of the reason his broadcasting home was acquired was because of him and his national prominence. And this is just from Talkers Magazine, the kind of Bible of this sort of universe, said the following in their obit: the aggregate amount of revenue Rush generated for operators of AM facilities carrying his daily talk show is nothing short of astounding. Rush, his net worth was around $600 million when he died, but that people estimate he made about $1 billion over his broadcasting career. He saved AM radio, many argue, taking it from the kind of obscure carrying sports and some televangelists and other stuff to really raise it to a national political height. You could say that Donald Trump would be impossible without Rush's certain brand of airwave populism, always rooted in what he regarded as constitutional principles and America and love of America. So we owe a great debt to Rush Limbaugh. He has his haters out there, but they should all go home. We honored Rush in the early 2000s here at the Claremont Institute with our Statesmanship Award. He's a great man, a great American, and whatever else can be said of Rush, and I discount most of the criticism. It was clear he was a patriot and cared deeply about his fellow citizens and his country, and that was really evident in his. I mean, he's made tons of money. He's a very, very wealthy man, was a very, very wealthy man, but got diagnosed with cancer in February of last year and really carried on till the end, pretty much. I mean, was broadcasting a couple weeks ago, and it's a remarkable life.
Yeah, as much as we talk about the kind of veil of silence behind which people are forced in elite universities, in some corporate workplaces now, and increasingly just in the culture in general, that sickening feeling that you suspect the going narrative is wrong, but if you say so, then you'll be a pariah. And so counting the cost, you just don't speak up. That dynamic is so real and so pervasive. We're also aware of it. And yet, even so, I don't think we reckon with how total the blackout was on right-wing views pre-Rush, and for how many people he pierced that veil. It's the difference between knowing that you're being kind of gaslit and kept silent, and not even being aware of it because it's just the water you swim in or the air you breathe. When you turn on any radio station or any major cable news network, and it's just taken as read, not argued for or presented as a point of view, but taken as the premise of every statement, every broadcast, every argument, that nobody sensible or fashionable or smart or elite believes in God or loves America or thinks that that patriotism is anything other than outre. Then to have somebody with whom you can relate speaking over the airwaves in a major way into your home, into the privacy of your car, is just utterly transformative. It shows a kind of courage that is and has been infectious. We all owe something to it. I owe, a paternal debt to it, because Rush was a big part of my father's long transition away from liberalism and toward conservatism, which of course then the tree begetting fruit then sort of passes on into my own life. It's one of uncountable stories of how people were just suddenly given permission in the way that we all strive to give permission to folks to think the unthinkable, to say the unsayable. And he'll be deeply missed, and we all, I think, kind of carry on his legacy. He created in many ways the context in which we even do this show or speak to each other.
I couldn't help but notice a lot of dismay coming from the other team on the internet today, and there does seem to be this impression that that Rush was kind of like a catalyst for real resentful anger. And my recollection and my experience as an on-again, off-again listener to the radio show and watcher of the television show and reader of the books and on, is that there's a mistake there that is more or different than an ideological one. I mean, this is a guy who spent hours, uninterrupted hours, day in and day out, talking without guests, without all the tropes of like TV talking head performance art that can be relied on to get you through a segment. It was just him and the microphone, and going, getting into a rhythm and staying there in a way that so many people found so listenable that he was in a class of his own. I mean, maybe Howard Stern is like at that level, but Howard, Howard had to change his persona a couple times and like change his format a couple times, and has settled into being sort of like one of the last great interviewers around, much less on radio. That's kind of the lane that he's found, and it's been a journey for him, and not without its humiliations. And Rush is just it was Rush from day one all the way through to the very end. And so I would submit that it is just not possible to execute that kind of career, that kind of relationship with the medium of radio, unless you are very listenable. And if you are trying to do the outrage of the day
and having fun. Yeah.
Well, yes. I mean, this was a big part of it. This is a guy who had a smile on his face. He was funny, but not too funny. He was political, but not like exhausting to the audience. He wasn't trying to beat them over the head with things every day. He wasn't in a state of panic. It wasn't the crisis of the instant. It was very not television. And it was very deep and protracted and smooth in a way that made it possible to just kind of have Rush on throughout the day. And then, we wake up one day and it's 30 years later and you just kind of had Rush on throughout the day for that period of time. You got to have a certain sort of persona, a certain sort of character, a certain sort of like of moderation of soul in order to pull that off, regardless of what time you're in or what your politics are. And, you don't see that a lot, didn't see that a lot over the past 30 years on the left. And to be honest, you haven't seen a lot of that on the right either. He's a very unusual guy. And just that, the departure of that energy leaves a big hole.
It's funny, James, what you say about how the left was addicted to talking about the anger and the rage of the right as embodied in someone like Rush. When it's funny because they make the same claims about Trump, that Trump is just, this just laden with fury. But I think anyone who listened to Rush or paid attention to Trump, I mean, it's discordant, because what I've always gotten from both of them was like the sense of like the happy warrior. And the fact that they both had a good sense of humor and seemed to take things kind of lightly. It's interesting how the left, which is actually the side that is humorless, enraged, constantly, crying or fighting or having their cortisol levels like leak out their ears, in their classic mode of projection, like throw all of that onto our side, where you don't really see it actually. Just one other thing, I remember in '94 when I haven't really seen this written anywhere. I haven't looked everywhere, but I do distinctly recall Newt Gingrich going on Rush's show and basically crediting him with the win in Congress when the House flipped Republican for the first time in 40 years.
94, yeah.
And Gingrich may have been just flattering him, but I remember at that time there was a sense that Rush Limbaugh and the Contract with America were like, there was like a new ascendancy. And I think there was a major shift at that point, and it led to welfare reform, the crime bill, Clinton's moderation, the failure of Hillary's health plan and all of that. So, definitely, he has a salutary legacy for America, certainly.
Yeah, the first term of the Bill Clinton era was completely scrapped, and it was 96, I'm sorry, when the Republican Revolution happened, sort of the big blowback to Clinton liberalism version 1.0, D.D. Meyer's liberalism. And it's true, it was Mike Pence too, I think, there was a clip of a young Mike Pence making the rounds where he said, I'm here because of Rush Limbaugh. And
a man who got started in radio. People
right.
forget. Yeah. Ironically, just a quick, I know Matt wants to jump in on this, but in my ongoing saga of I listen to podcasts that you guys don't have to, I saw Sean Wilentz on Bill Kristol's Conversations, and he was talking about Sean Wilentz, noted, I'd say, left of center, at least, historian of America. An interesting historian. But Wilentz says, Seth, that moment, that confluence of Limbaugh and Gingrich is sort of the beginning of the end of normal politics in America. And he does not mean that in a good sense, and draws a straight line to Trump, and then wonders with Bill Kristol, how can we get back to normal politics? I think you're right. And it's interesting that the smarter set on the left, I think, saw that being the beginning of that confluence of populist Limbaugh radio, and then this revolt of the people against entrenched congressional authority as the beginning of the end of their ascendancy and dominance.
Yeah, and I mean that isn't that they're half right, right?
Right.
They're half right in their claim, because I've seen these articles before by various people making this point, and they've made it about Rush from the beginning, that he was the seed of the anger and the evil of Trump. And really what they mean is a point that James makes frequently, that for a long time, the only continuous thread to an actual opposition to the left that was real, that was serious, came from Rush Limbaugh. And I over and over again throughout, my lifetime, growing up as someone, my mother, she texted me today, upset like many about the death of Rush. And she said, you remember, you were a little kid listening in the Sam's Club parking lot, to Rush Limbaugh. And this is a personal thing for a lot of people. I absolutely remember that. And the only time I've ever been really moved at all by say having some blabbings of mine out there was him doing a segment on something I wrote, and it just moved me personally, just a little bit personally, because he was he was such a personal part of millions of people's lives, and I was one of them. And I think he was navigating out in front. There's a famous line from Moby Dick where he talks about how the guys in charge of the ship think that they smell the wind first, and in reality, it's the people out there. It's the guy down doing the real work who's actually catching the wind first. And Rush was, he was never in polite company was he cool, right? It was always the case that if you were an intellectual on the right or the left, obviously the left, but lefty's the enemy. But even on the right, if you're an intellectual, you say, well, yeah, Rush says blah, 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 but you qualify it. But the fact of the matter was, he was leading the party half the time. And as James liked to say, there was probably 10 years where He was just the continuous threat of actual opposition against the left as the right degenerated. And in reality, he was leading the conversation. And a lot of intellectuals and publications and think tanks thought that they were in charge and they were moving with the times, when in fact, he was at the forefront with the people. And one thing that I think really is really striking about him is the anger point you guys make is absolutely right. He was never angry. He wasn't angry. This isn't anger. And Trump too. This is crazy what they say. They're projecting their own sickness upon the rest of the American people. But it goes beyond that, right? What Limbaugh was able to do, like anyone in radio has to do, is respect his audience, respect their dignity, respect them as fellow citizens. And he did this day in and day out. And he didn't sit there and condescend to the rest of the country, to normal people, sometimes saying idiotic things, right? He respected them as individuals. And people felt that from the beginning, even as he made fun of people out there in Yorba Linda when he was in Sacramento. In Sacramento, it's a little far out even today. Even when he made fun of people from Yorba Linda, he was your guy because he respected what you had to say. And that is an intrinsic sort of discipline, a mental discipline that then allows you to see clearly when you look at the political landscape. And I think he always had that. He always had that clear vision. And that's a very rare thing. And then just one last thing, and I'll stop. There are very few people in history who've been able to resurrect or spearhead or lead an entire medium of communication. And here is where, of course, no respect goes to Russian normal society. If he had been on the left, there'd be people in tears in the streets right now. They'd all be, millions of people would be at his funeral, et cetera, et cetera. They'd be talking about how he was the great American hero and all that. And that's why I'm so glad Trump gave him that award. I am so glad Trump gave him that award in the face of the rest of these sickening elites. But just as on the other side of politics, there are very few people whose persona is able to resurrect and dominate an entire medium. And AM radio was a dead thing, right? It really is true. AM radio was sort of a dead thing. It was an old medium that had been superseded by new ones. And Limbaugh was so talented at that medium, he was able to get the contracts he did because he resurrected talk radio because he fit the medium. And he never worked anywhere else, right? He wasn't able, TV, he'd last for 5 seconds and then disappear. But it's very rare. It's a historic talent to have someone who's so talented at the medium they're communicating in that they literally bring it back from the dead.
That point you make, Matt, about the way we talked about Rush in polite conversation is particularly important, I think. And it's something he shared with a number of really some of the greatest thinkers and statesmen, Churchill, C.S. Lewis, this quality that people sometimes have where even if you like them, you feel a little bit ashamed to say you like them or to say that you estimate them quite as highly as you do. And it has to.
They purposely want that to happen, right? So when someone who's actually really brilliant, really talented becomes popular, the other side then wants it to be like, well, you should be embarrassed to like that person who's actually really clear and articulate and brilliant.
Yeah, and it has to do, I think, with the incredible courage it requires to speak plainly. I mean, jargon and just elaborate sentences and all of the stuff. I mean, look, they have their place. There are some ideas that require, a lot of verbiage to get across and to unpack. But plenty of the time, fancy language is a shield. It's a way of sort of like not being understood so that people think that you must be smart, right? And the people who don't do that, in fact, who do the incredibly difficult job of, as James was saying earlier on Tell Me What You Really Think, he was saying he would just unpick these strands for you. And Nick noticed this about him too, actually, that he would unpick all these different strands and then just present them in this incredibly personable, straightforward way, because he thought that things that mattered should be comprehensible to the common man, since the common man is like kind of what it's about, anyway, to do that is to expose yourself to the charge of stupidity and of being gauche and sort of lowbrow, because you don't have all the trappings, and Rush did that on purpose. He was perfectly capable, I think, of pretty high level thought, and people who are capable of that kind of thought but forego it in the interest of communication deserve particular gratitude and praise, because they're not likely to get it a lot of the time. They don't get recognized for just how much intellectual capacity that requires.
Yeah. Well, we should get to our three governors, but yeah, I just want to say, as I did at the beginning, he'll be missed. A legend we will not see the like of, to quote James in a separate thread from this morning, ever again, I don't think. Well, I want to talk about Cuomo, Newsom, and DeSantis. That is New York, California, and Florida. This is really, as I said off air at the beginning of this, kind of to set Seth up to talk a little bit about New York and Cuomo, but he's got a book coming out in May on New York and de Blasio, which you should check out. Go purchase. Google Seth Barron, Amazon, pre-order it. Or if you can't yet, bookmark it and come back. Anyway, Cuomo is in some hot water these days because those who are not as clued into this COVID scandal, just to catch you up, Cuomo hid the extent to which his policies ended up super spreading COVID through nursing homes and killing a disproportionate amount of old people in New York in the early days of the pandemic in New York. I mean, New York in general has a death per 100,000 rate that's pretty extraordinary, and it's probably at least half due to this botched policy with nursing homes, given the very vulnerable state of old people. In contrast to Ron DeSantis, who has a state with a lot of old people in it for all the obvious sort of tropey reasons of Florida and snowbirds and all that, and aggressively and early on sought to protect his elderly population and has a much better record to show for it. This is the case despite the fact that the media, given the politics of DeSantis and Cuomo, have painted relentlessly the opposite picture. And so Cuomo, got an Emmy of all things. Or was he just nominated? I think he actually got one.
He was awarded for his masterful use
of television in his briefings on COVID. And then finally bringing up the back of the pack is Gavin Newsom, perpetual California rich pretty boy who happens to run this poor state of ours, who's they're trying to validate the signatures for his recall at the moment. And I hear, well, it's not a rumor, but Rick Grinnell looks to be running for governor of California, former ambassador to Germany for Trump, and then brief-ish tenure last year or so at the National Security Council. And so one of these is not like the others. Ron DeSantis, I think, has a bright future in Republican politics. But what do you make of the ruthless and thuggish Cuomo's prospects, Seth, in the coming months and political period in New York?
Well, Cuomo has faced scandal and travails before, and just bullied his way through them.
Yeah.
At one point there was a commission, the Moreland Commission, an ethics commission that was supposed to investigate, public corruption. And when it got too close to him, he just shut it down. And, he said very gruffly, he said, "Look, it's my commission. I can do what I want with it." This is the way he behaves. And we see him doing it now. I mean, apparently the U.S. Attorney's Office and the DOJ are going to look into what happened. Here's the thing. I mean, in the same way that I think it's absurd that people would say that Trump was a mass murderer of 300,000 Americans who died because of COVID, I think I would not necessarily go and say, oh, Cuomo killed all these people.
Right.
I mean, yes, the policy turned out to be not a good idea. At the time, it did seem as though the hospitals might get overwhelmed, and maybe it was, maybe it was an allowable mistake to send the people back to nursing homes. Whether that policy should have continued as long as it did is another question. But what's really repulsive about Cuomo is his denial and his just relentless insistence that he not only was not at fault, but that he was somehow the savior of the country. And that if it weren't for him, things would be so much worse. And of course, the media's complicity in elevating him in this way and sanctifying him. And, then, of course, as his aide, Melissa DeRosa, confessed last week, they, talking to Democratic legislators, she said, well, the reason we didn't want to tell the information, give the data out, was because we were worried Trump would basically weaponize it, that he would send the DOJ after us to do an investigation and politicize it, which is just an admission of obstruction of justice. So, that was stupid.
Well, we've seen that the response to all this from Cuomo is to do these spots where he's standing out in a snowbound New York City with a handful of not particularly distinguished interpretive dancers, promising that the lifeblood of New York will return because a smattering of creative types will be allowed to perform publicly, of course, donning masks and all. And this is just, when Arthur talks about this toxic romanticism that is used to cover up a decadent weakness that's just eating away at the life force of America. This is just a picture portrait of that kind of romanticism and how it's shamelessly deployed by Cuomo and all too many others in order to take people's attention off the complete dereliction of political duty that ought to be the centerpiece of the conversation.
Yeah, he's grotesque. Just a quick example. Right before all of this broke, early in February, he said, yes, we're going to reopen restaurants in New York City to in-person dining on February 14th. and it was just so obvious he was trying to make it that, yes, because of me, you can have dinner for Valentine's Day. If you get lucky that night, you'll remember who to thank. That was the implication.
Yeah.
Really grotesque is the only way to put it. But
it's Cuomo or Pornhub. Those are your choices.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if he skates by.
Yeah. No, and the Valentine's Day thing too, Seth, there's that personal thing too. But I'm married to a former chef, and it's also good for the restaurants and throwing them a bone, right? The busiest restaurant day of the year, Valentine's Day. Yeah.
Seth, I'm back on. Seth, can you lay out for people? This is so juicy. Can you please lay out for people just what this guy is like? Because, a lot of people, if you don't live in a state and you don't have a sense of the political scene, even if you're fairly based and you understand these people are all fake, you don't have a sense of what actually the persona is like. And it's usually various kinds of awful that you can't really imagine. And so what's your take on, who Cuomo is? What is this guy really like? Who is
Cuomo? Sure. Here's the thing about Cuomo is, his father was a 3-term governor, and he just grew up as his oldest son, not very smart, but with a kind of political cunning, like an animal cunning. Just a real bully. He's the type of guy who, currently here's the thing. He's never, he's a very political guy, but he's never run for a local office. He only ran to be for statewide office because he's deeply uncomfortable dealing with people one-on-one. So he never had to glad hand in the way his father did to run for local office. He has no personal charm. He has no personal touch. His ideal thing is
he's the opposite of Ryan Williams. He's the opposite.
he's the opposite of Ryan Williams, precisely. He's really into. He's one of these guys who rides a Harley around that looks like a motorhome, like one of those gigantic Harleys, and that's his common touch to ride around with a looking like, I mean, honestly, like just a complete dork. He'll do things like drag an ancient roadster that FDR used to drive around and have it repaired so he can drive it in the inaugural opening of a bridge that he named after his father. I mean, he's terrible. He's just a horrible bully and consumed with self-love and mythologizing his own reputation. He's probably the most odious character in American politics. I mean, I was telling Spencer earlier that he and Trump are kind of weirdly like doubles. I mean, they're both from Queens. They're both like, the children of successful men who, loaned them their name. I'm not going to push that too far, but there is a weird way in which I got the feeling that Cuomo's antipathy towards Trump was sometimes informed by this dynamic. I don't know if that explains it. I mean, just the fact that he wrote a book praising his own leadership during this horrendous summer of 2020 when thousands of people were dying.
He ran for president.
Cuomo?
Yes, he was a candidate, right?
No, I don't.
Bloomberg, right?
Bloomberg ran for president. De Blasio ran for president.
Oh, it was de Blasio. That's right.
Yeah.
People thought Cuomo might step in, but he never did.
James is confusing him with a slightly less odious, but maybe even more incompetent New York politician, de Blasio. Certainly more radically left-wing and less conventionally Democrat.
My mind has been rotted away by reading too many issues of Town and Country magazine. April 11th, 2020. Will Andrew Cuomo ever run for president? The governor of New York has been a central figure in the coronavirus response. Will his newfound popularity spur him to throw his hat in the presidential ring?
I'm sure he eyed it. I'm sure.
My question is whether these people on some level believe their own hype. Like, it's probably hard even for virtuous folks to win an Emmy and not think that they're the bee's knees. And this like eminently venal character being showered at every second with just lugubrious praise, just sort of like weeping adoration from the only people they think matter. Like, there's probably not a lot of remorse there. Or Seth, do you get a sense that there's something underneath the facade? It just seems to me like this is like this guy is completely sold on his own cult of personality.
He's completely sold. He's just a mammoth egoist. I mean, and de Blasio is an ideologue, does come from like an ideological ascendancy. He was lifted up on. Cuomo is just about power, just about leverage. I mean, that's why he's fundamentally like horribly uninteresting. He's just like in the open mouth of a shark.
yes, exactly. So my brother and I, Seth, who still lives in New York State, we grew up we were in New York City. We were in Western New York. But my relatives, my father's side, were all from the city and all in various ways, all there. And so we grew up, with the tabloids, like, New York Post, Trump, Ivanka. I mean, this was part of like what we saw growing up. And the Cuomos were a big deal. And my brother and I have always had these conversations about Trump throughout our lives, way before he was even running. And also Cuomo. All of them. And I mean, Trump's when Trump was doing real estate right back in the day, he was willing to pay the firm for services that had a young Andrew on it in order to get development projects. Well, his dad was governor, right? In order to get development projects passed. And so I just one anecdote that I thought was hilarious that you might also enjoy. So we go back to Central Park New Year's Eve, which is when I got engaged to my wife. And because I'm not a complete heartless bastard, and every once in a while an old married man has to build up some new credits in wife heaven, I got her a new engagement ring because she had lost the old one. The diamond fell off. Terrible tragedy in our family. A little personal Peterson moment here. And so what I did is, with 4 kids, I went back to Central Park. We didn't know exactly where it was. And I told the kids, this is how we proposed. I gave her a new ring, and much cheer, much love in the air. It was great, a New York moment. And since all the crap happened there's not a lot of people there. So we walked back, and just like we did when we got engaged, this time with 4 kids, we're going to go and do the ride with the horses around the park. So I choose, as you know, they're all hustling for attention. I choose this guy who looks straight out of, central casting for either a Godfather Irish guy, or pick your director. This guy is straight Irish New York. He's flying the flag literally on the carriage. So we get in, and after some not so secret handshakes, he starts talking politics, and it's very clear where he stands. And this guy is your old Democrat who's a Trump supporter, who's loving the conversation and ignoring some of even his usual stock conversation about this is where Macaulay Culkin shot Home Alone 2, and this is where whatever. And he starts talking politics. Now, his take, to cut to brass tacks, was sort of like this. He's like, at the very end, when we're really, as close as we can be to talking honestly, he's like, well, with still an accent, which I'm not going to imitate. He says, de Blasio, yeah, he's crazy. He's ideological, but he's kind of a clown like. And he's like, Cuomo, there's a real stink about him. There's a real stink about him. And I mean, he's laying it on thick, with every performative aspect he can muster to say he is a dirty bastard and he'll get you and he's evil. And de Blasio, you may talk about him socialist, whatever, but he's just an idiot, or he's not serious. But Cuomo, he's a bad, dirty person, and it was hilarious to me. I mean, there's a real stink about him, Seth.
I think that's accurate. I think that's accurate, and I think that's how people do view the two of them. I think that's right.
Yeah. Well, we can't get to our final segment. We've run out of time. I just point everyone to this National Post story about the Republican Party at the local level getting back at the senators who voted to impeach him. I was just going to make a joke about how Donald Trump can do anything. He can even revive the spirit of the 17th Amendment with state legislatures reviving their jealousy about their senators' conduct in distant Washington, D.C. But thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to support our work, go to claremont.org/donate. If you want to learn more, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, and claremontreviewbooks.com. Don't forget to rate, review, share, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Rate us well, please, as Spencer always directs. Thanks to the production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Annalisa Lee. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you next week.